really great that we are able to meet a small virtue, a very small virtue of the larger pandemic and all the harm that it's caused. But it's really great that we can meet in this way. And I also thank Christopher Muhozi for taking the time to be the discussant today. I have some slides which I'll share in just a minute. But before I do that, I just want to, I guess, give a disclaimer that this is old work. This is, Pamela asked me to present on my motherhood book. And so this is work that I published in 2013, and it's been quite fun to revisit it and go back to it. But it's not based on my more recent research. I just finished writing a book on the conceptual history of poverty and wealth in Eastern Uganda, which should be coming out next year with Duke University Press. And last year I took a break from teaching and I went back to being a student, and I completed an MA in climate and society at Columbia, and my new research is moving into looking at how, at historical climate change, understanding what changes happened in the climate in the past and how societies responded and the various ways they responded. So that's sort of where my research is going. I also want to say I'm thrilled to see Professor Musisi here, because her work was really an inspiration for me when I was a graduate student and starting out on this project. So thank you to all of you for joining, but I'm especially pleased to see you here, Nakanike. Okay, with that, I'm going to share my screen. I think this audience probably doesn't need this map, but here it is anyway, to just, for any of you who may have forgotten where we are. In July of 1881, Father Ludel of the Société des Missionnaires d'Afrique, or the White Fathers, wrote an entry in the mission diary. In it, he related a revelation a visitor had made to him about Muganzirwaza, the Queen Mother, the Namasole of the Kingdom of Uganda. He wrote, "The Namasole who came to Rubaga is not the mother of Mutesa. The real mother of the king was in the past sold to an Arab by Sunna, Mutesa's father. On his father's death, Mutesa had her searched for everywhere, but in vain. He thus named to the title of Namasole a trustworthy slave to whom his mother had entrusted him before leaving Uganda." The veracity of this statement was hotly contested in the 1930s, when the Uganda Journal published the diary entry. Two leading intellectual figures wrote to the journal, insisting that Muganzirwaza was Mutesa's real or biological mother. They argued that the story that Gwolocha was his biological mother was fabricated in order to discredit the Namasole. Mukasa went so far as to claim that what would never be done would be for a Kabaka to sell or give away any of his wives who had borne him a child. But the truth of the claim is not what is most interesting to me as a historian. What I find most compelling is that during a period of intense political turmoil in the kingdom that ultimately led to the outbreak of civil war, some in the palace sought to undermine the power of the Queen Mother and the king by challenging their biological relationship and by claiming low status origin for Muganzirwaza. This makes it clear that claiming that the Namasole was not the king's biological mother was a means to undermine her authority, and by extension, the authority of her son as well. This raises some fundamental questions for us. Why was the relationship between the king and his mother so important? What did it mean if she was not his real or biological mother? And what did it mean to be a mother in Buganda? This seemingly minor event in Buganda's history offers us a glimpse into both the enduring nature of the place of motherhood as ideology and social institution, of public motherhood, a phrase that I borrow from Laurel Semley and Chikwene Okonjo Ogunyemi, in what is the place of public motherhood in politics and the intense contestations over its role. Father Ludell's diary entry highlights the way in which motherhood in Uganda had become almost exclusively a biological relationship, so much so that a challenge to the blood relationship might undermine the highest authorities in the land. This emphasis on biological motherhood was in contrast to the neighboring societies of Busoga and Bugwere, where alternative models existed. In my book, A History of African Motherhood, I sought to uncover the history of motherhood in the societies of Uganda, Busoga, and Bugwere, and to a much lesser extent in Bushana, in order to bring women much more explicitly into the historical narrative. Doing so enabled me to bring a different lens to bear on the history of the region before the 20th century. Because these are societies that have followed patrilineal descent for generations, and because of the particular nature of the turbulence of the 19th century, they are often described as highly patriarchal. Furthermore, many of the sources available to us as historians, whether archives, ethnographies, or oral traditions, have been produced by elite men with clear interests in shoring up certain narratives about the past. By taking motherhood as my lens, I was able to uncover a good deal of evidence that exists in these sources unintentionally, and that gives us an alternative view onto the past. That past is one that had surprisingly diverse forms of motherhood in neighboring societies in a small corner of the world, and that saw significant changes in those forms of motherhood and their roles in social, economic, and political life over the centuries that I examine in the book. I want to talk a little bit about methodology now. A history of African motherhood encompasses around 12 centuries from the 8th to the 20th. And this is in part a function of the methodologies that I draw on to reconstruct the history of a region that has no written sources that date earlier than the 1860s, and that even then are limited in nature. We don't have diaries from ordinary people or even from extraordinary people, nor are there written constitutions that explain the purpose and meaning of having a queen mother govern alongside her son. At the same time, we do know that the region that Uganda now covers has been inhabited for several millennia, and that people speaking Bantu languages have likely lived in southern Uganda for the past 2,500 years. So how is a history of motherhood in Uganda for over a millennium possible? The question is twofold. How can we reconstruct the history of the East African interior before the 19th century? And how can we reconstruct the history of motherhood in particular? The answer lies in an interdisciplinary approach that draws on a range of methodologies and evidence. In this case, I used a combination of comparative historical linguistic reconstructions, comparative ethnography, oral traditions, and archaeological data, as well as archival sources for the more recent past. This is by now a well-established approach in the history of places and times beyond the reach of writing, including East Asia, Oceania, and Indo-European history, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. But those of us who do this kind of work remain rather thin on the ground. So I will take a few minutes to sketch out my approach. The use of historical linguistics to write the history of oral societies relies on the premise that related languages are descended from a single proto-language, and that a proportion of the lexicon or vocabulary of contemporary languages is inherited from their proto-language. It is thus possible to reconstruct some of that early vocabulary. Language is not purely functional. We use words to name and describe our physical environment, but we also use them, importantly, to talk about our spiritual, intellectual, aesthetic, and ideological worlds. Reconstructing relevant lexical items gives us insights into those wider fields of past experience, just as it does into the material world. By tracing the etymology of individual vocabulary item, we develop an intellectual history for that word. The borrowing of a word from neighbors, the coining of a new word, or the narrowing or expansion in the meaning of a word are all the result of actions by individual members of a speech community which reflects social, cultural, economic, and political changes. Such word histories provide the basis for writing history, but give a rather sparse picture and don't reveal the context in which the words were used. Drawing on the ethnographic record allows us to begin to reconstruct some of those contexts. Ethnographic data does need to be used with care and in conjunction with the independent streams of evidence, such as from historical linguistics or from archaeology, in order to avoid anachronism. But by doing so, it is possible to use comparative ethnographic evidence while avoiding an ahistorical analysis. Finally, oral traditions in literature are also rich sources for this kind of history. They too can be complicated sources of evidence, shaped as they are by the moment and authors of their transcription. They cannot be taken as literal descriptions of past events, but they provide a wealth of detail, sometimes it seems almost unintentionally, that allows us to see what was important enough to be remembered or forgotten. These different sources, it bears emphasizing, do not on the whole permit the reconstruction of individual lives. Oral traditions are the exception to this, but even then they tend to be focused on a very small elite. Instead, these sources tend to reveal society-wide changes, including tensions and conflicts over social norms and the ideologies underpinning social and political organization. So while Proto-North Nyanza speakers and their descendants don't speak to us through the written word, they do speak to us through several different mediums. The reconstruction of historical vocabulary allows me to write the history not only of Proto-North Nyanza speaking people and Baganda, Basoga, Bagwere, and Bashana, but also of people speaking Proto-South Choga and Proto-East Choga. Comparative ethnography adds complexity and context, as well as illuminating practices during the 19th century. And oral traditions and other oral historical evidence make possible the writing of the history of motherhood in each of the North Nyanza societies. When all of these sources are brought together, a tapestry unfolds to reveal the complex and often surprising social, political, and economic history of North Nyanza, viewed through the lens of motherhood. So let me turn quickly to the classification of the languages of this study, that were the focus of this study, and that sort of underpin, and the classification therefore underpins the reconstruction of the vocabulary. Luganda, Lugwere, Lusoga, and Rushana are all Bantu languages, as I'm sure you all know, and are descended from a common ancestor that scholars have named North Nyanza. The genetic classification of these languages reveals that North Nyanza is a subgroup of the West Nyanza branch of Great Lakes Bantu. North Nyanza gradually diverged from West Nyanza and became its own language in the second half of the first millennium, and it then in turn broke up in 3 stages. The first stage in the early second millennium resulted in Luganda and South Choga. The second split around the middle of the second millennium saw South Choga yield to Lusoga and East Choga. And finally, in the early 19th century, we see East Choga yielding to Lugwere and Rushana. And here we have a map that just gives a sense of the geography of these languages. So as again, this audience is undoubtedly aware, Lugwere, Lusoga, and Luganda are spoken in an arc that reaches from the western shores of Lake Victoria Nyanza up to Lake Choga and across the Mpologoma River. Slightly further to the east, in the foothills of Mount Masabo, Mount Elgon, live the people who speak Rushana. And Rushana speakers are a very small community. They're not counted in the census, and so it's difficult to be sure, but number just in the thousands. So for the rest of my talk today, I'm going to give examples of different moments that I cover in the book, starting with the earliest period the time during which people spoke Proto-North Nyanza, in order to give you a sense of the ways in which I approach motherhood and its particularity, and in particular, the way it connects with social and political developments of the region. So starting with North Nyanza, I want to focus on motherhood and lineage politics in particular. People speaking the North Nyanza language, roughly between the 8th and 13th centuries, organized their communities along patrilineal lines, but they gave continued and renewed importance to the connections that were formed by and through mothers. A woman's children were known as Baiwa by the people in her clan and lineage. Her brother in particular had an interest in her children, but so did her father. Both people had specific rights in and responsibilities towards their sister's children. Matrilateral ties like these cut across patrilineal divisions and were a means of creating cross-lineal networks at a time when North Nyanza speakers were settling in new lands and experimenting with more intensive banana cultivation. The people who spoke Proto-North Nyanza did not follow bilateral descent, so they didn't follow both matrilineal and patrilineal descent, nor were there matrilineal clans. They followed patrilineal descent and their clans were patrilineal. Nonetheless, North Nyanzans maintained a more complicated form of social organization than such labeling suggests. Matrilateral ties in the North Nyanza speech community were not merely a relic of a time when their ancestors followed bilateral descent. They were rather an effective strategy for creating cross-lineal networks at a time when the community needed the broadest possible support base in order to ensure its survival and prosperity. The importance of these matrilateral ties and networks formed by and through mothers alongside patrilineal groupings was reflected in linguistic innovations and in specific social and cultural practices. The root ihwa that North Nyanza speakers use to talk about their sisters' children can be traced back to Proto-Bantu, and so is an ancient term and an ancient concept. In Great Lakes Bantu, the grandparent of North Nyanza, the noun yipwa described a child lost to the mother's patrilineage and gained by the father's lineage, as David Schongren has shown. To some extent, these children were also lost to a woman's patrilineage in North Nyanzan times, in that they belonged to their father's lineage. But there was an essential ongoing connection between a mother's kin and her children that is reflected in the comparative ethnographic evidence. It was Baiwa who washed the bodies of their maternal kin in preparation for burial and who assisted in the special ceremonies for twins and at other ritual occasions. If a Mwiwa succeeded to political office, his maternal kin could expect to benefit from their new connection to power. So while Baiwa didn't belong to their maternal kin, they were also not entirely lost to them. The continued connection between a mother's kin and her children was thus a strong feature of North Nyanza's social and political life. For North Nyanza speakers, a mother's brother had an especially strong connection to her children. People speaking East Bantu, which is an ancestral language of North Nyanza 4 nodes back on the linguistic family tree, innovated a word for maternal uncle, madume, with the literal meaning of male mother. Although they kept this word, North Nyanza speakers changed its meaning to male in-laws. They then coined a new word, koiza, for maternal uncle. The etymology of this new word remains unclear. There is a verb in Lunyoro from the Rotara branch of West Nyanza, and that verb is koija, that means to be greedy or to be gluttonous. It's possible that this verb may reflect the perceived greed of maternal uncles in a neighboring community. Whatever the etymology, that North Nyansans innovated a new noun to name the maternal uncle during this time suggests a change in either their perception of him or in his role in the lives of his sister's children. One explanation may lie in the political developments of the period that opened up new possibilities for power. North Nyansans continued a trend initiated by their West Nyanza-speaking ancestors, namely a move towards kingship with at least some control over land. This political trend led to the consolidation of power in North Nyanza, placing ideologies of motherhood at the heart of political complexity. A woman's son would have relied on his maternal kin to support his claims to power, and reciprocally, a maternal uncle would have benefited from his muihua's political success. The Khoiser of a politically successful man, we can surmise, would have wielded considerable authority in these early political formations. The Queen Mother was appointed to her office at the same time as her son was made king. In the polities that emerged from the people speaking Proto-North Nyanza, it's likely that the Queen Mother, in the polities that emerged among the people speaking Proto-North Nyanza, it's likely that the Queen Mother was ideally the senior wife or kaidu of the deceased king. The new importance for the senior wife, as opposed to other wives, perhaps the wife who had borne the most children, or the wife who bore the first son in the household. The etymology of kaidu seems to point to her role in managing food production for the household, while Père Leveux, in his dictionary from 1917, connected it to the word for male slave in Uganda, omudu. David Schonbrun has reconstructed the original meaning of mwiru, the underlining form of omudu, to be peasant or farmer. He noted that the meaning of male slave was only given to the noun much more recently after the breakup of North Nyanza. Thus, it seems most likely that kaidu is a diminutive form, meaning little farmer, rather than having its origins in references to slavery. So here we can see connections between household organization, economic production, and political power. Moving on to Buganda and spanning from the period in which Luganda sort of clearly emerged as a language around the 13th century, right through to the 19th century, by which point Buganda had obviously become a very powerful state in the area. Although the evidence suggests that they inherited the office of Queen Mother from their North Nyanza ancestors, Baganda created a new word for the office and for its holder, Namasole. The most plausible etymology for this new noun is the Great Lakes Bantu verb sola, which is derived again from a Proto-Bantu verb, so an ancient verb, chod, meaning choose or pay tax. In Great Lakes Bantu, sola had the primary meaning of remove, gather, or collect, and it had secondary or derived meanings of to reveal or to judge by ordeal. In West Nyanza, the parent of North Nyanza, it also had the meaning of uproot, and in Luganda, Okusola has several meanings, including to dig up groundnuts, to clear, to sift, to peel, and to examine. The etymology thus links the Namasole, or the Queen Mother, to the harvesting of crops, the levying of taxes, and the judging of crimes. Through these related meanings, the derivation of the noun Namasole directly linked the Queen Mother to her political role and her authority in the kingdom. The office of Namasole of Uganda was a powerful one. She shared with her son and his queen sister, Uluwuga, the title of Kabaka, and she was the most powerful commoner in the kingdom. She was a commoner because the royal family followed the broader social practice of exogamous marriage, and so kings and princes married outside of the royal family. John Hanning Speke, the British adventurer, explorer, proto-colonialist, wrote in his published account of his visit to Uganda in 1862, he described in his writing, in his account, he described the Namasole in the following terms. The mother of the king by this measure became Queen Dowager or Nyamasole. She halved with her son all the wives of the deceased king not stationed at his grave, taking second choice, kept up a palace only little inferior to her son's, with large estates, guided the prince-elect in the government of the country, and remained until the end of his minority, the virtual ruler of the land. At any rate, no radical political changes could take place without her sanction. And so we can see from this description that in the mid-19th century, at least the Queen Mother was a very powerful figure. On acceding to her office, the Queen Mother lived in a separate palace from her son. And according to oral traditions, this practice dates to an early period in the kingdom's history. It was certainly the case later, where we have descriptions of the palaces of former Queen Mothers maintained as shrines separate from those of the deceased kings. Though it was on a slightly smaller scale than the king's, her palace otherwise replicated his. And by the 19th century, at the latest, it included large retinues of women. And Professor Musisi has written about this aspect in particular of the increase in scale of the numbers of women that were kept in chiefly and royal households. The Queen Mother had owned chiefs and governed parts of the kingdom directly, raising taxes on those estates to maintain herself and her retinue. Her people didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the king or of his chiefs. She was the one who held power over them. In wider society, the son of any wife in a polygynous household could become his father's heir. And this is a development in Uganda that reflected a growing emphasis on the biological motherhood of women, and as we'll see, was different in Busoga. So in the king's palace, almost any prince could succeed his father, with some clear exceptions that are noted in the oral traditions. This created a great deal of political competition. And again, the traditions narrate that the political competition could lead to fairly extensive bloodshed. But this also meant that the position of Queen Mother was particularly important. Royal wives and their families set out to create alliances with influential chiefs to ensure that it was their son and their family's mujwa, the nephew or the female clan member's child. It was their one that became king and his mother who became Namasole. So the competition wasn't just among the princes, it was also importantly among royal wives whose political influence was key to determining who would succeed. Some of this political work is remembered in the kingdom's oral traditions as far back as Chimera and his grandson Tembo. One example of a royal widow endeavoring to become Queen Mother is that of Nanono. Nanono was a wife of King Nachibinge in the 16th century. And she was remembered for helping her husband in a war against the neighboring kingdom of Bunyoro by sharpening reeds for him to fight with when their spears had run out. Despite this effort, Nachibinge was killed in the battle. On his death, it was Nanono who is remembered as reigning as regent. The traditions give us two explanations for this unusual event. And it was unusual because she herself did not have a son. So one of these was that none of Nachibinge's children from his other wives was old enough to take the throne. And again, this doesn't explain why another of his wives or of his widows who had a son why she didn't become regent instead of Nanono. The other explanation is that according to the traditions, Nanono was pregnant, and presumably she hoped that she would bear a son and could thus become queen mother to him, ruling as regent until he came of age. In the end, however, her child was a girl, and so Mulondo, the son of another royal wife, ascended to the throne. Although she didn't succeed, that Nanono is remembered as having been able to postpone the enthronement of Mulondo is an indication of the power and political influence that some of the king's wives were able to wield in the kingdom. But her failure also points to the importance of motherhood to the political legitimacy of kings. Mulondo is remembered in the traditions for the influence his maternal kin held during his reign. He was very young when he was enthroned, and although the traditions don't directly state that his mother, Namasole Namulondo, acted as regent, they do refer to her power and influence. Indeed, the stool on which he sat to enhance his stature, because he was so young, was named after her and stood as a physical symbol of her influence, especially over a young king. When Namulondo died, her brothers brought a number of her female relatives to the king for him to select her heir to the office of queen mother. Not many aspiring queen mothers are remembered in the oral traditions of Uganda's kingdom. That some do, including Nanono, is no doubt due to the exceptionality of their actions. Most queen mothers would have gained their offices through a combination of their own political skill and the influence of their lineages and clans. To succeed his father to the throne, a prince would certainly have required the support of his mother and her relatives. The role his maternal kin played was recognized by the successful prince, and the relatives of a royal wife could expect to receive significant benefits from the political transformation of their kinswoman from wife into Namasole, and of their mujwa or nephew into king. The importance of the ideology of motherhood to political power in Uganda was manifested in the distribution of important chiefships and other political offices to the maternal kin of the king. One of the Namasole's brothers would be appointed to the powerful position of Sabaganzi, and the historian Christopher Wrigley argued that the Kakiro was regularly one of her brothers too, although the sources are not in agreement on this question. At the heart of political power, kings claimed their thrones with the support of their mothers and their mothers' clan members and supporters. Queen mothers held power that was nearly equal to that of their sons and used their political skills to gain authority and to hold on to it. However, this system was increasingly challenged by kings and powerful chiefs from the late 18th century on, and was largely undermined by the time Uganda came under British colonial rule at the end of the 19th century. We can see this in the case of Suna, who ascended to the throne in the 1820s. At that time, he was still very young, and his mother, Nakasi Kanyange, was also still a young woman. According to the historian Semakula Chiwanuka, she was, quote, one of the most beautiful women in the country. Queen mothers faced strict restrictions on their reproductive lives after acceding to office. They were neither to remarry or have more children. At one point, Suna heard a rumor that his mother was pregnant, and he was so enraged that he sent a leader from his army to uncover her, to undress her, in order to determine if this was true or not. In addition to this public humiliation of his queen mother and violation, he ordered her estates to be plundered and several of her chiefs were arrested, even though the rumor was proven to be false. Suna's actions not only violated taboos regarding conduct between a mother and her son, and between a king and his queen mother, They were also an attempt to undermine Nakazi's influence in the kingdom. As the economic and political changes of the 19th century unfolded, so the place of public motherhood at the heart of centralized political power was increasingly challenged. It survived, albeit in weakened form, through the reign of Mukavya Mutesa, but it couldn't survive the civil wars of the 1880s or the fundamental political revolution codified by the Uganda Agreement of 1900, even if the position of Namasole continued into the 20th century. And this is something I'll come back to in the conclusion. So moving on to Busoga, and it's unlike Uganda from the 16th century, Busoga was composed of multiple small kingdoms. And so we have the replication of these patterns in different areas, in different kingdoms, but in slightly different forms. So in Busoga from the 16th century, succession was a less open affair than in Buganda. In a system that they inherited from their South Choga-speaking ancestors, Busoga preferred that the heir, whether to a kingdom or to an ordinary household, should be the son of the Kairu or the senior wife. If the senior wife did not have her own biological children, she was able to adopt a son through a process known as pita. Proto-South Choga speakers had borrowed this verb from neighbors speaking a Nilotic language. And so we see, for example, in Acholi, the verb pito, meaning to rear or breed cattle, feed children or raise children. An important feature of pita in South Choga is that it referred to both the fostering in of children and the fostering in, to translate the term over, of calves. The association of pita with both the fostering of children and of calves indicates that this involved the creation of relationships of obligation between the person taking in the child and the person giving it, and similarly with the livestock. So wives, and perhaps senior wives in particular, who were unable to become mothers through biological means, had this possibility to become mothers through social needs. Another way for senior wives in Busoga to become mothers, other than through biological reproduction, was by bringing a woman from her clan as a junior wife into her husband's household. According to the ethnographic evidence, any children born to the new wife would belong to the Kairu or Kaidu. I describe this as a model of social motherhood in contrast to the model of biological motherhood emphasized in neighboring Buganda. And in Buganda, we see female infertility being widely disparaged. This is very common in the oral literature, for example. In Busoga, as in Buganda, there were particularly strong connections between a woman's lineage and clan and her children. At some point, perhaps coinciding with the arrival of clans of Luo origin from the 17th century, many patrilineal clans created specific names for their abaiwa, the children of the female clan member. And they particularly created these for girls. Many of these names were coined from the name of the eponymous founder of the clan. So a girl Omuiwa of the Abaisi Hemula clan was known as Nai Hemula, and so on. David William Cohen noted that although the sons of Owini Karoth men were raised in the households of their Lusoga-speaking maternal kin, daughters tended to remain in their father's households. Luo daughters were therefore crucial in the cultural exchange with Lusoga speakers. By giving particular clan names to their daughters' children, Owini Karoth and others in Busoga emphasized a connection with their Abaiwa and reinforced their role as cultural intermediaries. In Busoga, Abaiwa performed essential roles in various ceremonies and rites associated with the birth and naming of twins, as well as those associated with funerals and with succession. Abaiwa's ritual connections with their mother's kin groups was frequently supplemented by strong political ties. The political relationship between maternal kin and their Abaiwa was strong, and a grievance committed against a powerful Omuiwa could lead to warfare, as occurred between Busiki and Bukono in the late 18th century. Wakauli, whose mother was from Busiki, had succeeded his father Kisozi to the throne of Bukono. According to the oral traditions, Wakauli turned out to be a bloodthirsty tyrant, and the people of Bukono rose in rebellion against him and ultimately killed him. His maternal kin, however, were unhappy at this murder of their nephew, and they gathered an army and attacked Bukono, leading to war. Although it was not successful in the end, the attempted invasion of Bukono by Wakauli's maternal kin points to the lengths to which clan members were prepared to go to defend their Omiwa when he was in a position of power, and therefore also defend their connection to power. Powerful clan members would also get involved in succession disputes, precisely because they stood to benefit greatly from the accession to the throne of their Omiwa. Indeed, just as members of a mother's kin group benefited from his success, and Omiwa often depended on his mother's kin to achieve that success. And that mutual dependence served to reinforce the connections between a woman's children and her kin. David Cohen has shown how Southern Lusoga speakers and their descendants, within a generation or so, they became Lusoga speakers, but how these Lusoga speakers and their Southern Lua speakers and their descendants formed new polities and took control of existing ones in Lusoga. They did this by creating networks of relationships with indigenous Basoga population through exogamous marriage, and by sending the sons born to these marriages to live with their non-Luo kin. As a result, the heir to the throne in these Luo-ruled kingdoms was always the son of a Musoga woman raised in her natal home by her parents or her brother. This practice placed the heir at the center of a web of networks that connected his Luo origin patrilineage and his Basoga maternal kin. The founding narrative of the Kingdom of Bugweri provides a good illustration of this core role played by Basoga mothers in creating alliances. In the early 17th century, Kakaere is said to have arrived in Bugweri from Bunyoro and seized control of the kingdom. He came with his wife Kawaga and her clan members. When he arrived in Bugweri, he married again to Nakaziba, a Musoga woman of the Abaise Kaziba clan. When Kakaere died, it was Nakaziba's son who succeeded Kakaere, rather than any of his sons from his other non-Musoga wives. The requirement in the Luo-ruled polities for the king's mother, and hence his queen mother, to be Musoga, demonstrates that these ruling families derived much of their legitimacy through the motherhood of Basoga women. The Luo immigrants and their descendants introduced some of the ideological underpinnings of political power, but they also incorporated into their kingdoms the particular ideology of motherhood that underlay Soga social and political organization, an ideology that had deep roots in South Chogan and North Nyanzan history. While Basoga wives and mothers were at the heart of Luo claims to political legitimacy, their natal kin also benefited from their place at the center of power. At the very end of the 18th century, or perhaps the start of the 19th century, a man called Mwanda of the Abaise Ruba clan settled in Namaganda in the kingdom of Bugabula. He apparently thrived and became very rich. And in particular, he had large herds of cattle. But his many large herds of cattle destroyed the gardens of the king's wives. The king ordered that he be moved to another place where his cattle could be fed, and he was given the village of Nakabira. His daughter, Sati, in time married the king of Bugabula, perhaps in exchange for the land that Mwanda was given. Stasi's son became king, and she became queen mother. In their traditions, the Abaise Iruba remember that the royal family gave them Nakabira as the estate of the queen mother, Sati. The connection to power through having once been the clan of the queen mother of Bugabula was such that they were granted lands for the use of generations long past her reign as queen mother. So then moving on finally to Bugwere and to the three smaller kingdoms that we find here. Around the mid 1780s, so in the late 18th century, A stranger-speaking Ateso, a man called Laki Omugobera, arrived in the Banaguere polity in Bugwari. He arrived during a time of famine, and he used his skills as a hunter to establish him in this new land. He encountered a hungry family of 2 widows, their children, and their mother-in-law. After providing them with meat, he married the widows, and he became a significant figure in the community. The tradition of Laki Omugobera has some aspects of myth to it, in particular the motif of the skilled hunter who overcomes his stranger status by providing food in the time of famine. The historical evidence for Laki Omugobera's existence is strong, however. His son Yua founded the Balalaka chiefdom around 1810. Equally strong is the evidence of famine around the time of Laki Omugobera's arrival in the Banaguere polity. The Banaguere called this famine Matiama because many people fled to Bugwere from further north and east to avoid even worse shortages there. And then they stayed. In Lugwere, people say that Batiamire, they sat down. Many of those who arrived at this time, like Laki Omugobera, were Ateso speakers. And we also have evidence about this famine from oral traditions among the Ateso, as well as from the settlements in lakes in the region. And this is, in fact, this famine is something that I'm currently working on for my current research by looking at the reconstruction of the hydroclimate from tree rings, as well as evidence from lakes and oral traditions. So the prominent role women played in the tradition of Laki Omugobera's integration into Bugwere and his son's subsequent establishment of the Balalaka polity suggests that women had essential roles in integrating Iteso and other immigrants. Intermarriage was a powerful tool of integration, and the linguistic and historical records for Bugwere indicate that this occurred at high levels. Yua's political control of the Balalaka chiefdom also underscores the place of public motherhood at the heart of political authority, because his legitimacy as a ruler derived from his Mugwere mother, reflecting similar practices among the Lua rulers in Busoga. We see a similar practice in the origin story of the Banaguere clan. The clan developed in the early part of the 17th century, most likely soon after the people who came to speak Proto-East Choga, the ancestral language of Lugwere and Rushana, soon after they settled to the east of the Mpologoma River. Members of the Banaguere clan claimed first comer status in Bugwere. According to their traditions, Naguere founded the clan and the polity that it came to rule. Naguere's position was, however, legitimated through his paternal grandmother. According to the traditions, Chintu traveled through Bugwere on his way to Uganda from Mount Masabo, Mount Elgon. On his way, he stayed at Naboa as the guest of Luba, and he married Luba's daughter. She, along with their son, Mugoya, remained in Naboa when Chintu moved on. Mugoya was raised in his maternal grandfather's household, and his son was Naguere, remembered for founding the Banaguere polity, and whose descendants ruled it until the arrival of Kakungulu at the start of the 20th century. Regardless of whether we accept this narrative as fact and the invocation of Chintu in particular might lead us to question this, it served a political purpose in which networks and claims to legitimacy were created through motherhood. So I'm going to conclude by sort of summing up some of the developments right at the start of the 20th century, and then give a bit of an overview. The long-standing historical importance in this region of public motherhood, the establishment and legitimacy of political power, officially ended with the signing of the Uganda Agreement of 1900, which stripped the authority of Uganda by placing it and its people under the administration of a British protectorate. Some members of the Ganda elite did very well out of the agreement, as it transformed political estates into private property. The reigning Queen Mother, Evelyn Kulabako, and her brother, the Sabaganzi, benefited in this way. That they were able to negotiate such a settlement offers a reminder of how important the Queen Mother and her kin remained in the polity, even after decades of conflict and upheaval had undermined the institution and the role of public motherhood in the heart of politics. But, and Holly Hanson has also written about this by transferring the historic power of the Queen Mother, as manifested in the estate she controlled, into the private holdings of the reigning Queen Mother. The settlement with Evelyn Kulabako destroyed the economic basis of the political office and thus a major source of its political influence. Once stripped of economic and political power, the Namasole became merely the king's biological mother. The Uganda Agreement also brought Busoga directly under the purview of the British. Here too, politics was redefined as an all-male affair. Initially ruled on behalf of the British by the warlord and chief Seme Kakungulu, the British replaced him in 1914 with a principal court composed of 7 or so members of the Luchiko, or council. These were the kings of the old Busoga polities, or their male heirs. When they lobbied for a paramount office, it was a singular one, the Isebantu Chabazinga, or the father of the people who unites them. Despite the long-established and crucial importance of an ideology of motherhood in Soga polities, developments after 1900 ended the role of public motherhood among the Basoga even more absolutely than in Uganda. A similar story unfolded in Bugwere, where Seme Kakungulu also played a prominent role. There he replaced existing polities with an administrative system based on the Ganda model, and one too where mothers and motherhood had no place. We might then see this as a narrative of decline in women's agency and in the place of public motherhood in society. From around the 8th century, people speaking North Nyanza used motherhood as a central means of creating durable communities. They placed women's maternity at the center of networks that cut across patrilineal clans. While those interclan networks facilitated ordinary life through the creation of broad webs of obligation and support, they also underwrote the centralization of political power into royal families. As a form of governance that embodied social reproduction, the ideologies and realities of motherhood lay at the heart of emergent kingdoms. In those kingdoms, public motherhood took on a central political as well as ideological role through the office and the person of the Queen Mother. After the emergence of Uganda around the 13th century, competition for the best land intensified along with political centralization, and Baganda emphasized biology in their ideologies of motherhood. Nonetheless, through the powerful roles played by mothers and their kin groups in Ganda political life, public motherhood remained important in creating these networks of obligation and support across clan divides, even if it was increasingly contested. While queen mothers were central to the political successes of their sons, tensions between them were often deep. The 19th century saw powerful attacks by kings on the offices and persons of queen mothers. These attacks undermined the role of public motherhood in legitimating political authority, and it was increasingly replaced with legitimation through violence, whether by the king or by increasingly powerful chiefs. Colonization enabled elite Baganda men to remove the social institution of motherhood from the political system entirely. The history of motherhood further east, however, offers an alternative narrative, one of human agency and adaptation, and not simply reaction to declension. Bagwere and the Bashana-speaking their neighbors drew on an inherited ideology of motherhood to construct and reconstruct communities in a complex and changing human landscape. As a social institution, motherhood enabled women and men to adapt to new circumstances, to integrate outsiders, and to sustain social reproduction in relatively marginal lands. Bagwere women and men developed and used a more flexible ideology of motherhood to incorporate newcomers and new ideas into their social formations, and to minimize conflict through the creation of seriated networks of obligation and commitment. This is perhaps the enduring legacy of this history of motherhood, that it offers people a political and social alternative that can effectively cut across the ethno-linguistic barriers modern politicians have worked hard to solidify. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I see the virtual applause going on in case you can't hear it with your ears. With that, I would just like to hand it over to Christopher Mahosi for his comments before we open the floor to questions.
I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear it.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the excellent talk, Professor Stevens. So these are my thoughts and questions that would have been invited by this excellent work and talk. So when I refer to the work, I'm referring to her book, which she, I don't know whether you can see this, which she, on which the talk is based. So first of all, I want to comment on the idea of, which is a long settled debate or question of Africa not having a history. So in spite of the fact that it has been settled, there might be still some questions lingering out there. And so this work gives an emphatic yes, that Africa has this long history. In as much as recently we see what I would call a recentist trend of writing Africa's history, mainly focusing on the 20th century and now 21st century. But this work, which stops at the end of the 19th century, tells us that we have a rich history. We have a rich history to talk about. And of equal importance, Professor Stevens shows us how we can overcome challenges of methodology, of sources to reconstruct Africa's deep past. Because usually that's like the reason why people want to focus on an era where they have archives and that kind of stuff. So of equal importance is the category of focus of this work and talk. Women and their agency in building social networks and enduring political communities. Now, this is not a subject, you'll agree with me, that we tend to accord a lot of attention, even when you look at women as a category, we don't always do that. And in history, this is lacking. So for that, again, I wish to commend her. I also would like to use this little time to applaud Makerere to give us this talk about part of Uganda's history. This is research about Uganda. And in most cases, we don't have these opportunities to talk about research on Uganda. It's carried out in Uganda, and all we have is a book that is not easily accessible. And so in as much as this is a virtual event, international event, but hosted by a Ugandan institution and discussed by a Ugandan, this is great that we are talking about Ugandan research on Uganda, and it's being discussed in Uganda and partly by Ugandans. So allow me to go ahead and pick out certain topics that stood out for me and in a way which I would love to hear more about. And these are not necessarily like questions which you have to respond to. These are just comments. So it appears that a women's clan was behind the innovation of the institution of the Queen Mother for the Lugano and the Namasole, because it appears they stood to benefit most out of the role of this institution, in as much as Hassan counted on the support, of his maternal clan. I like the linguistic reconstructions of Kairu, and the link with Mwiru and Mudu. Is it possible then that we can trace the origins of the role of the Queen Mother and the role of Kaidu in the organization of labor at household level? Or for that matter, their role in household production and organizing relations of production at that level. It also appears from the talk that political complexity undermined the role of public motherhood in its quest to build enduring social networks and political communities. Complex political institutions were characterized by increased centralization, the creation of which involved violence, fighting, raiding, killings, all of which increasingly negated or sidestepped the role of public motherhood as more women were captured as slaves and married off, violating existing marriage procedures in which public motherhood was central. It's also clear that the institution of Namasole mimicked a similar role at household level. This was mentioned in the talk. So changes ushered in by the Buganda Agreement and similar agreements with Busoga would have affected not only the institutions at higher level, the Namasole, for instance, but also those at a lower level, at the household level. So I'm wondering, how much do we know about the rearrangement of roles and agency of women at lower levels of social organization after the 1900 agreement? I know this was mentioned towards the end of the talk, but this is something that caught my attention. Rhiannon, in your methodology on languages, which I like very much, Luganda is older. Sorry for the interruption. This is what happens when you are on Zoom and when you are using your phone, then you keep receiving calls which interrupt your what you're trying to do. But anyhow, excuse me, I have to. I'm sorry, it's fixed now. So in your methodology on languages, Luganda, which is older, about the 13th century, and then Rusoga follows, and then the Lugwere and Roshana, those having been recently innovated in the 19th century. I'm wondering whether there's any link between the durability of a speech community, like how long a language has been in existence, and the development of complex political institutions. That is to say, that the longer the durability of a speech community, the more likely to have developed complex political institutions. I'm just trying to think through that. I don't know whether there is anything to think about along that line. Lastly, the talk makes a claim about presenting a social history of Uganda. And the book, when you look at the book, it makes a claim about presenting a history of motherhood, African motherhood. There is no doubt that these are Ugandan societies, the focus of the book and the talk, and indeed African societies. But I'm wondering how much of the practices and history of these societies mirror Uganda's history, and for that matter, if you like, Africa. I would like to end by saying that in spite of these last criticisms that light criticisms which came last, this is a talk about a subject that is less studied: women agency in political practice in Africa's deep past, and focusing on a period that is less focused on, less studied. So I would like to invite you, those watching and listening to me, to join me and thank Professor Stevens for this excellent talk and for her research on motherhood in Central and Eastern Uganda. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. With that, I don't know, Rhiannon, if you would like to respond to some of those comments, and then we could open for questions from the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christopher, for those comments that were very insightful, and actually has given me some new things to think about with regards to this project that I haven't been thinking about a lot recently because I've been doing other work. So let me pick out a couple of things that you pointed to. And partly, I should say that some of your questions actually speak to aspects that are developed at length in the book, but that are obviously not in a talk of this length. So in particular, your question about the innovation of the institution of the Queen Mother, I don't make an argument about the exact origin of that. I don't think we have access to that. Some scholars have written about West Africa and have argued that there's an element of, so like Ife Amadiume has argued that there's a dual sex organization of African societies, and so that there's this need to have a balance between a female queen mother and a male king. And Sandra Barnes argued in the 1990s that there was the role of the Queen Mother was there sort of central to the political formations because she was supposed to act as a check on the excesses of her son. I don't actually agree with that, because at least in Uganda but also in Makerere, we see Queen Mothers advocating violence and leading the charge towards warfare and behaving in ways that we wouldn't stereotypically associate with motherhood. And part of my argument is that motherhood encompasses all of those aspects, right? It's not just about nurture. But so there are those arguments that sort of get to the origins of why you have a Queen Mother. What I do look at in the book is precisely this idea that the etymology of Namasole is connected directly to economic production, to the organization of labor, and similarly the Kairu. So and the idea that the Kairu, that etymology comes from farmer, points directly, as I said in the talk, to I think the origins of this in household composition and in the organization of the economics at a household level, but also that then feeding into the broader social structures that we see that then was reflected in political centralization. And just to sort of quickly get at your last point, I guess that's where I sort of argue that this is writing a social history of Uganda that's different, right? Because by taking a different look on this, we're able to see the centrality of these women, or of women, to the social organization of Uganda in a way that has tended to be sidelined in the history. Although it's very nice to be in this virtual room with historians who have been critical in rewriting that history. So your point about the political complexity undermining the role of motherhood, I think ultimately I agree with that. I don't think it necessarily has to play out that way. We have examples from elsewhere on the continent where you have very long-standing political complexity, and queens and queen mothers remain extraordinarily powerful. I do think your point about the violence of the 18th and 19th centuries and the importation of large numbers of enslaved women into Uganda was important. Nakanyike has shown that this really worked to undermine the standing of women in Uganda and of wives. And that also, because I don't think that you can put this ideology of motherhood and just enclose it within the royal family, because it's connected to the broader standing of women. I feel that that was an important aspect that allowed kings to increasingly challenge and chiefs to increasingly challenge the role of motherhood in political power. I really like your question about what the Uganda agreement did to ordinary households. It's not, because that's really where my study ended. I didn't look into it, but it's a fascinating question, and I would love to see someone research that. I think that the idea of what the privatization of land did beyond just the elite circles would be, and the impacts of that on women across Uganda, I think would be just a fascinating study. So if there are any new PhD students in the audience, or if you have any, I would really recommend that as a topic. And then your question about the durability of speech communities. So Luganda is older as an individual language, although it obviously hasn't remained unchanged since the 13th century. It's changed a lot since that time. I think one of the things, so if we look at Lugwari and Rushana, we can think of Proto-East Choga as sort of early Lugwari, right? And what happened in the early 19th century is that in this context of famine, there was conflict, and some Lugwari speakers moved out of the area to the foothills of Mount Masabo or Mount Elgon. And so it's hard to know, like, what's the origin, right? Is the language older because you have more political stability of a certain kind, and so you don't have groups splintering off and moving into different areas? Or is the political stability coming from the sort of social stability of the speaker community, the political complexity emerging from this, the social stability of the people speaking the language, right? So I think they probably work in a symbiotic relationship. I don't know that you could say one is the cause of the other. All right, so I think I'll leave it there, but thank you again for your comments. They were fantastic.
Thank you so much. So the floor is now open to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat. Yes, I see a hand from Arthur George Kamya. You like to unmute?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh yeah. Thanks very much. That was a fabulous topic. I learned a lot, and I appreciate that. I guess I have two thoughts. I mean, maybe on the public, biological, social motherhood, can we add sacral motherhood or religious motherhood? The little that I happen to be in Uganda, the role of the Bajwa, the reason that the Bajwa is sort of wash dead bodies, or they're actually responsible for putting down, dealing with a clansman who's hanged himself, they actually literally have to take care of burial ceremonies. It's precisely because they're insiders who are sort of can be privy to, the clan, issues, but they're also outsider enough that taboos don't, because taboos essentially go at, the reason that, people from your clan don't want to touch your body when you've committed, is because maybe there's some evil spirit, some taboo that will sort of infect them, right? So there's a state in which it seems to me there is sort of a religious, there's something ritualistic or religious or sacral that sort of women play, that maybe sort of would sort of, I think thicken or make this sort of reconception of motherhood, thinking about it in that way. That's the other thought I was thinking about is, I guess the binaries. I was kind of disturbed by this, the binaries of sort of bilateral descent and patrilineal descent. Sort of touching on the same issue. I mean, it seems to me that women, at least in Uganda culture, I mean, women sort of go to, they get married and they go to their father, their husband's clan, but in a sense, they also stay involved in their families as Sengas. Sengar is sort of, is very important. I happen to know, sort of in most Uganda men's wills, when an heir is being sort of installed, they'll tell you, your father tells you when when the daughters, when your sisters come back, when they're children, you always give them a room, a house, something, So there's a sense in which, I don't know that actually any of these binaries sort of work. I mean, essentially women, it's a patrilineal society, but, women and daughters are also sort of actively involved in their clans, and their children are involved. So maybe I guess I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that sort of they're both insiders and outsiders, maybe these sort of the binaries don't quite work out to sort of explain what goes on. But thanks very much.
Thank you for those two comments. So the first one, that's really interesting. And I do write in the book about these ritual elements or religious elements, but it hadn't occurred to me to rethink motherhood along those lines. So I need to go back and think about that more. But I do write in the book about this, the role of Bajwa as insiders and outsiders, and the role of taboos, who would be affected by those taboos and who wouldn't. But I didn't elevate it to that level. So that's something I need to go away and think about a bit more. On the second point, I completely agree. I mean, that's sort of the argument that I'm trying to make. So maybe I need to go back and check that I was how I'm talking about it. But precisely that, right? That we have this idea that the societies are organized in these categorical terms. And if you talk to not so many anthropologists anymore, but a certain generation of anthropologists, and some of them are still knocking around, they would argue that a society is patrilineal and it follows this specific form of descent, and it can't ever change, right? And so I think historians have shown that there clearly have been changes in the descent practices of African societies, African communities. But my argument is precisely what you're touching on, which is that just because a society decides that children belong to the fathers and to the father's clan, it doesn't mean that these other connections that are formed through mothers are not important. And in fact, I argue they are perhaps equally important, because you depend on them for managing these dangerous moments, like a suicide, like the birth of twins, like death, like a succession dispute even. And they also create networks of support that you can turn to, that are broader than your patrilineal group, and also that are located in different parts of the region, right? So whereas the clan might all be living more or less closely together on clan lands, the matrilateral connections formed through mothers give people access to a wider network that would be important in terms of crisis, but also, as people were trading or moving or looking to settle in a new area. So precisely that, I think your argument is exactly what I agree with. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Nakanike, did I see your hand up? Or
my hand was up and it came down. maybe to give someone else a chance before I come in. But if is there another person who has their hand up?
Not
No?
yet. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I just want to, I wanted to respond to the previous speaker's comment on the spiritual, like element of, like particularly of the political motherhood, like public motherhood. And I think, like here the discussion can be enriched by Schönbrun's work, like particularly, like that chapter when she talks, like all over the book, like she talks about the spirit, the spirit wife. Princesses become the spirit wives. That's why they are not married. But when, like this woman who has been married previously to a king, like ceases to be married officially to a state, like monarch, like in that tripod, she becomes, like the state spirit wife. And I think this is where I think if we extended that argument and like problematize like how one can become a wife, and out of a wife, like because the spirit wives, they are wives, but at the same time they are husbands, like they are female husbands. So like this is where I think I totally agree with you and my friend Polly Hansen, like that the Queen Mother was stripped of, of political power by the 1900 agreement. I'm in total agreement with you, but disagree that she, that she remained, just merely a biological power. Like that's where your book ends up, and I think also your talk, like on Buganda today, ended up. So like, if that would remain true, only when we have a non-controversial and contesting Queen Mother. So like with immediately after that, or with the 1900 agreement, and immediately after, we can see that Evelyn Kulabako, like plays that role. She has no political power. She's out. The land that she's given is, like stripped up. It has no like whatever. It looks like, like the political power and, like the power of this woman has been erased. But when we move beyond, like Evelyn Kulabako, and we go into Irene Drusilla Namaganda's saga with the Buganda Lukiko, like this clearly demonstrates that although, like the Queen Mother may have been stripped of their political power, but the ideology and institution, which you do so well, like in the first chapter of your book, like you make a very clear distinction between ideological mother, like the ideological motherhood as an ideology, and motherhood as an institution, and motherhood as biology. So you make those three, like distinctions. And I think, like, to say that she remained merely, like a biological mother, like you are stripping your analysis of the three other crucial elements of, like the role that this woman plays within the kingdom. So my argument basically is that as an ideology, or Queen Mother, like Irene Drusilla Namaganda's saga, with the political, like elite by that time, the Buganda Lukiko, like shows us that the ideology and the institution of Queen Motherhood, the ideology and the institution of Queen Motherhood remained a powerful tool in the political wrangles of, like of the kingdom. Like we know that, like part of the assassination of, Nsibirwa is attributed, to this case. We know that Kuruvia loses. We know that the Chief Justice is, told not to even, judge the case. We know that, the colonial establishment, everybody gets, involved in this. Why would they be involved if the ideology and the institution, was no longer, political? So when we come to the current, that will be a different, saga. But I think as long as we have a Namasole that, that still plays the Kanyange, that plays, the Nanono, that plays the Namrondo role, and, contests power, then we know that the ideology and institution still may not have been, publicly, viewed, but it remained public. And also, I think that, when we also look at the Lukuli, the Queen Mother's, palace, and I think here, Holly Hansen, with her work, of space, and so on, I think would do, more work on problematizing that, because the contestation, in the Queen Mother's crime, the so-called crime for having, married within the palace, the contestation was not the palace, itself, but a particular house called Lukuli. We tend now, historians, to conflate the whole palace as Lukuli, but there were different houses, Masengere, then Lukuli, and so on. The Lukuli was the house whereby, because when she takes over, and goes through this ritual that turns her into a Queen Mother, she also marries. She has wives. And the wives, the principal wife called Kadulubare is the one who stays in that house. So for her to have married, to have taken and slept with a man, not a Kadulubare, but to have slept with a man in that house is where the contestation is. So I think the spiritual, and touching it back to the source and origin of, the formation of the kingdom, I think still is very relevant. But I want to congratulate you on an excellent piece of work. I reviewed the book. I still love the book, and I'm using it, as one of my key, resources for a course that I'm teaching at U of T. So I want to thank you.
Thank you so much, Nagnike. And this was just fantastic. I feel like maybe we should, Yumi and Holly should sit down and write an article about this. It would be really fun to do. And yeah, I agree. I guess part of, so in the end, because perhaps the weakness is that I end the book in 1900. And so from the perspective of 1900, things look very different from what they look like in the 1930s. And so if I ever have the energy to come back, I should revisit that. But it would be really fun for us to sit down and try and write something and think about the space and precisely these arguments that you're making. So thank you so much.
And I like it because you are very humble about it. You said maybe later on we will learn more about this. So like you are not saying that this is it, but I think I just said where the book ended, and immediately, it's the same story, but the 40 years later, we have a different story. So congratulations. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Nakanike. Are there other questions from the audience? I could pick on. I've been just had a couple of interesting messages with William Musamba, who's one of our PhD student who's been doing research on Busoga. And I should first, William, I don't know if you would like to ask a question about, you had a question about Gonza Bato. I don't know if you would like to ask or if I can jump in. I think it raises, I mean, I don't know. There, yes, William.
Yes, Dr. Edgar.
Yes, sorry, I just didn't know if you wanted to ask a question about what you had asked in the chat about this connection with South Igulu and the role of motherhood in Busoga.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Edgar. My concern was whether there was any link between motherhood and political consolidation in pre-colonial Busoga, because whereas we are, there are some sources that talk about the role of a few women who were important in the political making of their children, little is discussed about their role in as far as that political establishment of those children was concerned. And then secondly, currently as we talk, we realize that compared to Uganda, where the Kabaka has a closer attachment to his mother's side, because he takes on the mother's clan, in Busoga, it is a purely patriarchal society, And can that explain why Uganda is relatively stable compared to the Busoga cultural institution? Because you realize that Busoga cultural institution has been in a series of contestations, court battles and counter-court battles, appeals and counter-appeals, ever since its inception as a colonial project in the early 20th century. Can that partly explain the negation of the role of women in political consolidation? Can that partly explain the current troubles that we are facing in the Busoga Kingdom compared with Uganda, where the king has a closer link with his mother's side? Thank you.
Thank you, William, for those questions. So I do write about, you sent me a note in the chat asking about some of the other figures in Busoga. I didn't go into all of them. I do write quite a bit about Kabalu and Inhensiko and Wambuzi Munana and some other examples in my book. So we can be in touch about that via email. The question of the clan and of the role of sort of centralization and how that connects, I don't know if I would say that that connects to the lack of of an effective centralization in Busoga today. I would say that there never was a centralized kingdom in Busoga. Busoga is sort of a creation of, I mean, it's a linguistic entity, but otherwise it's a creation of the colonial state in a way that Buganda isn't. And so if each of the smaller kingdoms had been able to continue, then they may have been more stable than you see with the Chabazinga, this effort to create a unified Busoga after colonization, and then trying to recreate that in the 21st century. So I don't know, but it's interesting to think about how we might think about the role of motherhood there, because I would argue that although in Busoga princes don't take the mother's clan, they are raised among their mother's family, and in them, or they were at least raised in their mother's households rather than in the king's household. And that, for example, in the example of Kabalu, is important in her ability to install her grandson at a moment of crisis. So I think it's more that they're just different political systems and that there are certain commonalities, but there wasn't the same large-scale central. None of the Busoga kingdoms was able to assert itself over all the others in the way that Buganda was able to do. And I think that is more what is reflected today than a question of whether one is more patriarchal than the other. I'm not sure I fully agree with that sort of argument. But let's continue talking over email. I'd be very glad to be in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. I see a comment. I don't know, Polly, if you would like to add to your comment or even to respond to the article suggestion that Rhiannon made earlier.
I think that sounds like a great idea. And I really appreciate Nakanyike's really trenchant criticism of my own writing about Queen Mothers, because she's absolutely right that I think I can't remember it very well, but I think that essay ends and the Queen Mothers, the economic basis of Queen Mother's power in land was taken away, period. Which of course was true, but as she points out, it absolutely doesn't mean that royal women didn't have all of the realm of action symbolically and spiritually and in terms of the forging of social connection that other people had in the colonial period. So it's just a really powerful, useful criticism. And sure, let's write an essay.
Thanks. So I'm getting a few questions in the. Thank you. And first of all, it's wonderful to see everyone, see Holly, see everyone virtually at least. We're getting a few more questions in the chat. There's been I've had a private message from Zaid Sakito about related, I think, to divorce. And I don't know if Zaid, if you would like to unmute and ask your question. And there are also a few others that have come in as well. Yes, Zaid, I don't know if you would like to unmute. He's asked to maybe, I don't know if he's, yes.
No, Dr. Edgar, it's not a question, it's just a comment.
Sure, yes.
Surrounding, it's a comment particularly surrounding the role of motherhood in kingship here in Uganda, where I say the role of mothers or motherhood can be depicted from none other than Muganzirwaza. That was, of course, wasn't her name, but it became a name adopted as a nickname following a mistake she made. And the Baganda now coined in that saying, Omuganzirwaza omusango, omwende lwajaganya, oba lwachachancha, literally meaning that the day the loved commits a mistake is the day the divorced or the hated wife, or in this case, the co-wife, will celebrate. But all this had to do with issues of politics surrounding motherhood and mothering in the Ugandan context. That's what I simply wanted to say. And perhaps I added on saying that our very own Kamkama Dixon wrote a very interesting piece on Muganzirwaza in particular. And I don't know whether host can contact him to share a copy with Stevens. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that would be a fantastic, if you were able to share a copy of that. I'd be very interested in that. I do write about, it's not about the Queen Mother, but in the article on marriage that I published in the African Studies Review, I write about divorce. And as I was writing that piece, I was struck that in the book, I had completely neglected to look at divorce. And it turned out to be quite a rich topic to look at as well. And so there was a significant vocabulary around divorce that pointed to its antiquity in all these societies. So I can share that with Edgar if anybody in the group is interested in getting a copy and has problems accessing it.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, we'll share that in the department. There's another question from Arthur Kamya. Perhaps for Professor Hanson or for anyone about the, I think, relationship about neighbors, basically. Is it easier to make a case for political motherhood among the Kikuyu? And I've also, maybe that's related to a question about how, going back to your map about the sort of the sphere, the scale of this analysis. And, I think, I'm thinking about the recent interventions like Richard Reed's book that make a case for a longer durée history of Uganda explicitly as into pre-colonial history. And I'm wondering about how we, that's in some ways that's also a political question about the deep past. And so I wonder about how we, how would you would frame your, motherhood and gender, especially in those debates as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good case. I mean, so just thinking about the Gikuyu, what's interesting is it's not a centralized society, right? So it's, and I haven't done any research there, but there is one of the oral traditions is that it was ruled by women, and then the men felt oppressed, and so they impregnated their wives, and when they were heavily pregnant, they overthrew them, and that's one of the Kenyatta in his ethnography, he has that story, and I'm just reading now Ngugi wa Thiong'o's reimagining of these stories, so I need to finish that and go back to it. But I think part of the argument is that this isn't. I looked at this one fairly narrow case, but over a long span of time, I'm sure that you could find a lot more in other places. And to Edgar's point, I think that's really useful because it is something. So my first project was just looking at these 4 modern societies and tracing their history back. But the book that I just finished on concepts of poverty and wealth, I looked broadly across Eastern Uganda. So it's 13 modern languages, both Bantu and Nilotic languages. And it also sort of goes into Western Kenya precisely because the colonial boundary is, of course, an artifact. And that does I did that precisely because I wanted to get a broader perspective and move out of looking just at closely related communities, but to try and see the extent to which some of these concepts were more widespread or translated across what we might think of as sort of ethno-linguistic or even economic boundaries.
Fantastic, and Nakanike, please go ahead.
Okay, I want to come into Kamya's question to say that I think much as Professor Stevens' work that may not directly help us to answer the question or address the question about the Gikuyus and, like the Mumbi, like a story or mythology with her 9 daughters. But I think, like much as I critiqued, like in my review, like the title of the book, like after second thought and after I started using the book for teaching purposes, I realized that actually what the book offers, like a methodology that allows us, like to make commentary and also, like insights to understand insights, like for the many people, like in the region, both in Kenya, like in Uganda, like that Great Lakes region, like if I may call it, Rwanda, Burundi, like all the way to southern, like Tanzania, and all the way up to, like the East African coast. So like she may not directly, like answer that question, but I think if we as students, like of the region, like if we utilize the methodology, or if we would encourage our students to utilize that methodology and insights that she brings into, like the terminologies and how the terminologies end up, like being utilized and transition, like to different times with different meanings, and attached to the environment, like political institutions, social and political and economic institutions, I think we can be able to deconstruct and learn more, like about many of these regions, whether they were centralized or in the process of centralization. That's my comment.
Well, thank you to everyone. We are coming up to the end of our allotted time. So I think I will just end by thanking everyone immensely for this really, really rich discussion, and for all of the questions, and for our presenter, Dr. Stevens, and the discussant, Christopher Mohozi, for these really, I hope these conversations will continue in other forums, on email, in person, if that opportunity becomes available, hopefully soon enough. I just mentioned at the end, we have you'll see we have a number of our of the departments, especially PhD students, have been online today and asked some great questions. And so I know that these are questions, even though I think Christopher raised this, that we're often, there's a presentist kind of moment or period in the field of African history, but I'm often seeing in these projects an attention to the deep past informing these research questions. So I hope there'll be a chance for more engagement on the connections that this work raises. So with that, thank you so much. I hope that next time it will be possible to do this in person as well at Makerere.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for all the fantastic discussion. This was really fun. And also I want to say to any of your PhD students, I'm happy to be in touch with them over email. So please just let them know that they're welcome to reach out at any point.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.